Hello and welcome everyone to a very special HashiCorp Live Community Office Hours. Today we're focusing on Amazon and Amazon Web Services. As you've probably heard, there's a lot going on with Amazon reInvent this week. And so we just wanted to talk about a couple of different things related to that. My name is Jono Sosulska. I'm a developer advocate here with HashiCorp. And with me today, we have Rosemary Wang and Martin Smith.
Hi everyone, I'm Rosemary. I'm a developer advocate at HashiCorp. I work at Consul Vault and everything in the middle. Happy to be on here. Martin?
Yeah, and I'm Martin Smith. I'm a senior SRE at HashiCorp on the HashiCorp Cloud Platform team. And I work on HCP and HCS on Azure and a couple of other things around the cloud platform.
Awesome. For all of our guests, I'd just like to have a brief reminder. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love for you to drop them in the chat. As you do, please keep in mind our code of conduct for this virtual space. In general, we ask, please be welcoming, inclusive, friendly, and patient. We've know there's a little bit of a delay in chat, so trust us, we've seen what you said and we'll get to it very soon. We ask that you please be considerate, respectful, and above all, professional. If you have any questions or want to review our code of conduct, you can find that at hashicorp.com/community-guidelines. With that, let's get started. So with everything we've seen at reInvent, one of the things that's been talked about quite a bit has been ECS, both with EC2 and Fargate. Martin, can you tell us a little bit about how we're using ECS within HashiCorp and what HCP kind of looks like with ECS included?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that we're doing with the Fargate flavor of ECS on the HCP team is using it because we know our customers use it, right? And so a lot of times we want to be sure that as we're building new features and merging code and reviewing pull requests, that we don't break any functionality. And so we actually use it, for example, for end-to-end tests. We build a lot of versions of Consul. You can deploy lots of versions of Consul and HCP, and we want to make sure every one of those works. So often we're spinning up Fargate tasks to actually connect back to the service that we provide on HCP and like start a Consul agent and store something in the key value store, exercise some functionality in Consul. I just like really make sure that what we're building so we can kind of do that agile thing and move fast, make sure it keeps working. And we also actually do that in large volumes sometimes for stress tests too. But mostly we're trying to simulate what we think the customers are going to do with it.
And with that, for those who may not know, can you explain what HCP is and why you're trying to connect these Consul agents to them?
Yeah, so the HashiCorp Cloud Platform is a platform. It's a SaaS offering. You can log into our control panel. You can, with the click of a button, create a network and create a Consul cluster. I don't want to spoil too much, but there's lots of features coming in there too that I could talk about. But the idea is that instead of having to run your own Consul cluster, you could use one that HashiCorp, with its expertise, can run for you. And so to do that, we have to make sure that we test those things before we make changes to the platform. So, yeah.
I'm curious because the question we get a lot is like Consul upgrading, right? How do I upgrade my Consul, et cetera? Do you find that there's significant differences between versions as you're running these tests? Like how wide are these tests covering in terms of the Consul versions?
Yeah, so we try to test versions sometimes even before the releases come out. That's something we work really closely with the Consul team on. And so that's been actually really great to work with them. But I think for the most part, our thing that we're seeing a lot of is we're upgrading really the bug fix versions. So we're not doing major upgrades. We try to stay pretty up to date. And, we use Consul internally as much as we use it for these tests, right? So we're upgrading Consul, Nomad, and Vault ourselves constantly. And the key seems to be to just stay up to date. We do find little differences though, or sometimes even more interestingly, when we run these ECS Fargate tests in large volumes, is we find sometimes like little race conditions where maybe the ACL system is bootstrapping and we realize that our test doesn't wait or things like that. But we really, it's fairly seamless, I would say. We don't really find a ton of stuff like that, but we do get to meet with the teams and really give that kind of feedback regularly. So that's great. But it's been pretty painless as far as running Consul.
That's awesome. So one of the questions that I tend to come across, especially with all of these different SaaS container options, is they're all trying to solve a different problem. What did you see ECS solving for you? And if you can, in particular, why choose Fargate for some of the solutions?
That's a great question. So one thing that we wanted to do is we do a lot of orchestration when we're providing the SaaS offering. And so we're spinning things up and tearing things down. And these tests are one of those things. And what we really don't want to do is leave around a lot of orphaned resources. So we're constantly trying to play cleanup there, right? Orphaned resources cost money. Tests fail. Sometimes you want to go look into them, but then you want to delete them later. And we really want to interact with as much as possible through an API. And so because of that, we actually started by looking at Lambda, and Lambda ended up having some networking quirks around running the Consul agent in it. Although we did get it running, we just couldn't connect to it. So we ended up switching to Fargate as sort of the next thing. And then I think we would have probably gone to EC2, but if ECS and Fargate didn't work, but because of the fact that Fargate can run a test without running the underlying EC2 host, that made it a really attractive proposition for things where we were going to either run a test really frequently in CI/CD or like run 200 at once, where we know that they're going to get cleaned up and we're not going to be left with a bunch of orphaned resources running around. And then also it's kind of great because we get this API to, start these tasks, stop these tasks, look at the CloudWatch logs for these tasks, all of that kind of stuff. If we had been doing this in EC2, it would have been just a little more work, not a lot, but a little bit more work to sort of wire all of that up to get logs back to CloudWatch and things like that.
So taking advantage of that flexibility that comes with a well-designed platform and the managed services that are already there to bring that visibility into play, it sounds like was a really big part of using this as a managed service.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of different patterns. We could have done, I don't think we really wanted to do it, but we could have done ECS with the EC2 flavor instead of the Fargate flavor. I know that if you look at console architectures on ECS, you sometimes see like people running one agent for their EC2 instance and still orchestrating a bunch of containers talking to that agent, whereas like Fargate might be a little heavier there because we have to run an agent like either as a sidecar or as in the main container with the application you're testing. But for us, yeah, it still made it easier than trying to fool with EC2 if we didn't have to. And, also we want things that look like our customer environments again. So I want to make sure that that's as close as possible to what people are really doing with the tools.
Yeah, I'm actually curious because it's I got to work on a guide for running HCP Consul with ECS and EC2 instances. And the big debate that I've been hearing is it possible to run a Consul agent for every single Fargate task definition? Like, does that scale? Have you seen any problems with that?
I haven't, although we're not really deploying like large sets of microservices, really, where this is something where we're simulating what we think customers might do. So it's not the same as sort of what we're orchestrating on our own for the HCP offering. I have seen it just in general in my experience. You see this pattern show up with all kinds of things. You actually see it show up with like logging products where the same problem exists. People running like for example, Datadog, if they're running a Datadog agent, they've got to run a sidecar container for every single microservice container they run, to the point where there's sometimes even more sidecar containers for your application than the actual application needs. And you see this with like, for example, Consul Connect too, right? And I haven't ever seen it be a problem in my experience running like larger control planes on Fargate. I've never really run into that being an issue for the most part. I mean, especially with ECS having like its AWS VPC networking mode and the containers being able to see each other on local hosts. Like it's pretty seamless in my experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting you brought up the Datadog agent because you're right. That is actually a very common pattern. You need to add all of these sidecars in. So are you of camp sidecar?
I guess so. I mean, it depends, right? If you're using another SaaS that charges by like, again, Datadog, not to keep going back to that one, but if you're on a model where you're paying per host and every container is a host, you've got to figure out like, do I really want to, every time I run another sidecar, it's like another, multiply by the number of containers you have, and it's that many more hosts to pay for. Luckily, Datadog has like a different calculation for containers, but there are SaaSes out there that don't. So I think that's the thing I would watch out for, is just not wanting to pay so much. And I really think you see that with providers that aren't quite so used to containerization in general. So they're not really ready to bill based on that. But you have that same problem if you're running ECS with EC2, ECS with Fargate, Kubernetes, really anything has that problem where you're not going to install something on the underlying host.
So when you run into these situations of not being able to control the underlying host, especially within managed services, can you talk about how that starts to come into play with Consul and how Consul is a networking product itself? What are some of the challenges you've seen when interacting with almost this like dark magic that is networking on a cloud provider?
Yeah, I mean, it's the downside to like the dark magic of everything is patched all the time, is that like if you need to debug something, it gets really hard. I think for the most part, you fall back on the tools you know. So I think you end up like, you make sure that even if you're running something in Fargate, you can always like still run it in EC2 and debug it. And for the most part, you're going to find it similar enough. I think, you're trying to use like AWS's ACS images, you're hopefully using things that are really similar to what's happening in Fargate. That being said, like not on the HCP product, but in general, in my experience with AWS, there certainly still are times where you have to open a ticket and go to support and say, what's going on in this network, right? Because you can't spin up a new EC2 instance and try ECS on EC2, and then like you may not have the same network, right? There's a different physical underlying host and you might not have the problem there. So you try to use the tools you know and move the problem into the tools you know, but sometimes you still have to end up asking them questions, especially when Fargate was really new. I think it was more of a problem than it is today. The support's pretty good now. They can answer most of those questions.
Shout out to the support teams of all managed service products. That is not an easy job in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, actually, speaking of networking, I know you mentioned something about Lambdas. I wish we had a whiteboard, like a really good whiteboard capability for this, but can you explain what exactly you ran into when you were trying to do the Lambda testing?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with like why we ran into it, but I could tell you what we found, which is when we started Consul agent, we had started a Consul agent in a Lambda. That was fine. We noticed that like the agent couldn't really introspect about its networking environment. And when it did, it saw different IP addresses than like what we would expect. And Lambda has two options, right? Lambda can either run outside of the VPC or inside the VPC. That inside the VPC is sort of a newer Lambda option. And we turned that on, and I sort of naively assumed that that would mean that it'd be really easy to do regular networking in the VPC. And it turned out that wasn't the case. And there's some sort of like NAT layer there. I think I've seen some of the like reInvent talks in the past talk about when they were optimizing Lambda, that like networking and allocating elastic networking interfaces for VPCs is like one of the slower points, I think is what they've said in the past. So it wouldn't surprise me if some of that is there to make Lambdas run quickly and start up without the overhead of like allocating network resources, but it means that there's this translation there, which didn't really like work for this sort of gossip protocol and this, what Consul does really well.
Yeah. If anybody has ideas, I ask you, please put them in chat, because now I'm very curious. If anybody knows anything about this, I'm very curious. But did you were there any quirks in terms of similar quirks in running this on Fargate? Were there any challenges that you came across with Consul in particular?
Not really. I mean, I think I'd love to do some of these tests with Console Connect too. That's one thing we're not really exercising right now, but would be like such a good fit for these tests. But as far as like challenges, I mean, really the challenges were more about Fargate than Console. They were, it seems like the speed that it takes to spin up a Fargate task is about the same as the speed it takes to start an EC2 instance. Maybe they're on the same underlying orchestration or something there, but that was just one thing we found is we thought, oh, Fargate's going to be necessarily like it's so lightweight, it'll be faster. And it's like, well, that wasn't really true. And, you know, I think one other challenge is like, I know there's a lot of interfaces to interact with Console. And we really wanted to use as native, the most native interfaces possible, right? So we could spin up a cluster in HCP, a console service, and then make HTTP requests to it. But like, and some of our original very naive tests do that, but then we were like, well, it's not really exercising that the right ports are open for Console to do its cluster communication, those sorts of things. It's just like trying to make it as robust a test as possible. Console does a lot of stuff. So it's like, what do you test? What do you not test? What do you make sure is, what is the thing that you should fail the test on versus what is like an FYI, right? Like if the cluster comes up and it's got quorum and then the agent can talk to it, is that fine? Or like, should you wait 60 seconds and then be sure that it still has quorum? Like trying to figure out the most real world use cases is probably the other trickiest bit. And do you use the KV? Does that really exercise the test for a customer that doesn't store key values in Console? Like, so just picking those things.
Yeah, it was like, so last year I was at reInvent and I did a demo with Cloud Map, and Cloud Map like synced catalog into Console, right? And it's effectively, if you have like Console in your data center and you're using Cloud Map for service discovery in AWS, you know, you have to have services that are in some ways able to discover each other. So I wonder if we went back and we did this exercise, like if someone did put Console in Fargate, you know, and synchronized the catalog in Fargate, you know, do you see any, I mean, do any of the tests cover this kind of use case, or it's mostly focused on sort of the functionality of Console itself?
Yeah, so we're not doing like, we're not running another service that's registering to the Console agent in Fargate and then, or talking with the Console agent back to the Console cluster and registering a service. That would be an example of like a great enhancement for the test. Even just some of the like monitoring features of like making sure that a Fargate agent is checking in would be like a really interesting one. Some of these are like tests over time, and we actually do run like long running clusters as well as tests, but we don't use Fargate for that. So that would be like, that might be an interesting one where if we like enhance that one to sort of follow along over time as services are registering and deregistering, actually would be a really interesting one to plug Fargate into as well, because if you used Fargate for a while, or even ECS, you'll notice that like part of the magic of like patching and all these things that are just taken care of for you is occasionally the container is stopped and a new one is spun up and you don't really have a say over when or where that happens. So it'd be like interesting if we could somehow simulate that for a test and like do some testing to make sure that that behaved well in Fargate, but that's so unpredictable. So yeah.
That was one of the fun things I learned as part of building a guide for ECS, but with EC2 instances. Sometimes I would register these agents in the task definitions, and they wouldn't necessarily get removed out of HCP. And through some, you know, some sequences of problems, like things not being deregistered, things being destroyed, if it didn't have the exact sequence, you would basically have unhealthy nodes sitting in HCP. And it's been since corrected because, again, there were a series of conditions that had to happen with health checks, deregistration, et cetera. But I had never realized there was a nuance, and this could potentially, you know, be a problem if you were running Fargate even, and you were constantly registering and deregistering agents, and you would see these unhealthy nodes. I would be alarmed if I saw it.
You might wake someone up. Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely.
No, it's true. I love those bugs. I mean, we definitely see those building a SaaS offering where it's like, if you do this 3 times and then you change the setting, you're just like, you're finding all of these really interesting bugs. And some of them are, you know, the way we've integrated with the underlying cloud providers and the way they work. And Yeah, it's like a whole new world of interesting edge cases we've found. So we always appreciate people reporting those too.
So let's take a second, actually talk about that. What's the approach for the team in this case on how you set up testing for testing out a SaaS offering? Can you kind of peel back the covers a little bit and maybe talk about what is a test case that the team is very proud of, or you particularly are very proud of, that you're now able to test for and catch, and like how you got to thinking about that solution?
Yeah. So one thing that I think is really cool about the way we're doing things is that we are also not just one team, right? We've got teams with SREs, we've got software developers focused on the platform side, software developers focused on like how to deploy console, all of these things. And I think that what's interesting is the way our tests have evolved over time to sort of build on each other and try to test some of these specific scenarios that I think is really an interesting strength of the SaaS world, and multiple teams building microservices that all, a user just sees HCP and that's the nice front of the building, but there's actually all of these pieces behind it. And we have this idea called a HashiCorp Virtual Network, HVN, which is a networking primitive, just basically so we can map that back to various cloud providers you might want to deploy on, and or even multiple products you might want to deploy together. And when we started our testing, this was just one test, right? It was like make an HVN, make a console cluster, connect to it, get quorum, all these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 done. And our tests have evolved over time such that like there's a different team maintaining the test that just is for the HVN piece. But then there's this other team that's maintaining the test for the actual console bits. And so it's an interesting problem because it's like, you don't want to wake up one team for a failure for something another team runs. But like over time, we've had to sort of pull them out and start only testing those bits, especially on pull requests and changes, so that like we can actually get the test to fail as close to the change that caused the failure as possible. So I'm proud of how that's evolved over time, and we use our own tools to do that, right? So the tests also involve Terraform. They involve like, 3 console on the control plane, console on the data plane, and like, but there's all of this orchestration where we're using our own tools. So I think it's really cool that all of that comes together in like a test that stops a problem from getting to a user that, would have broken their deployment. I don't know if that answers your question.
So it sounds like you have to be so serious about testing, and everyone has to be very invested in making sure that the testing strategy works. From my experience personally, I've seen software be developed where someone says, yeah, another team takes care of testing. And in this case, it's not just one team takes care of testing. It's that all of the teams throughout the entire supply chain have not just an ownership, but a passion for making sure that that delivery is there as well, too. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, exactly. And the teams have grown and grown and grown. And so like that passion and that like checking back and like pulling pieces of the test out and then another team owning them is like so important. And that like curiosity when they break is why, we're shipping fast, but also like not breaking these things.
I have so many questions because this is what's really interesting to me is that, it's consoles networking, effectively touching a lot of networking components. And I would say as someone who was working with a network engineering team quite a bit, testing a network could be pretty difficult because, again, as you pointed out, there's a lot of dependencies, including HVN, if there are things that go wrong there. So what, I know you mentioned it was organically grown over time, but if you were to sort of give some general advice to anybody who has shared services sitting on top of a network, what are some general approaches that you would take to testing to make sure your shared services are still good? So it could be like a CI framework or even console itself.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would think about is looking at like, if you're doing a SaaS offering, is like, how are your customers going to connect to you, right? Because if you're going to tell most customers to use AWS VPC peering, like connectivity in a VPC is like a troubleshooting problem on every AWS certification exam. It's like I think we saw in reInvent in the past few weeks, they've released like a VPC connectivity, like I think they call it reachability, something like that, troubleshooter. So there's like, it's clear that there's this problem of testing connectivity in VPCs. And so like, think about that. Like, are you going to support target gateways? Are you going to, a lot of people want to do what AWS does, which is put like endpoints inside the VPC, and like maybe you could do that. I don't, there's still some stuff that I think that they do that not everyone would have access to, but you could build an AWS-like service with an endpoint in your VPC. I think about like the best thing to do is to go look at like how you're going to offer it and make sure that that scales and that you can test that. Like if you expect to get hundreds of VPC peering requests an hour, make sure that like that actually makes sense in the cloud provider, and like make sure that that makes sense for something you can really test. Because if you can't test that, then like you can't test what your customers are going to come do. So for me, it's like very practically just thinking about the more that you can get right at the beginning of that design, and talk to AWS too, because right, they have their SaaS factory, they've got like a lot of support for people that are trying to build these tools, and like validate those approaches. Because if you find, for example, even if it's something simple like a limit that you can't programmatically increase, like your testing is only going to be as good as that, as those weakest points. So that would be my advice, is like validate your design as much as possible. Talk to other people doing it with the similar design to what you're doing. Make sure that, see what problems they ran into, collect as much information as possible.
Nice. And I guess the inevitable question is, what happens if it costs too much, right? Like for, a lot of the times, you get the argument, we don't want to have a full testing environment because it will cost us too much. So are there cost approaches that you take when you test Consul? Are there, factors that you take into account?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think we've not done is raise some of the limits. Like I just mentioned limits before. They're important that you raise them if you need them for your test, but also like, I think you get 5 VPCs in a region, like maybe you don't actually increase that limit, and then your tests start to fail when you've left enough orphaned test failures that there's 5. So maybe you start cleaning them up. You maybe use something like the AWS Nuke project that can clean up an account or something. So I would say like limits are one. Other cost factors for us, I mean, I think it's also about the timing of your tests. One thing we did was like, we thought, all right, for a while when we're building this software before it goes to public beta, before it goes GA, we're probably building more clusters than in the tests than real customers are out in the world. So like the tests are really important to us then because they're literally our only signal. But as the product matures and gets released, tests are only one component. So it's like, at some point, maybe you even decide you're going to alternate tests in different environments, or you're going to like slow down your tests and lower your thresholds a little bit, or run them on a pull request, not every 30 minutes or something, right? So there's like, tests can find operational things, or they can find like bugs in pull requests. So it's like, again, getting the test as close as possible means that you're not going to run extra tests, which cost money. So I would say like limiting it, getting it close to the change, that sort of thing. And then if you have a lot of customers on your platform, they're like, you've got real data that's even more high quality than the tests you've got. So you want both of those things. So that you can kind of tune them, lower one as the other increases to help with cost too.
So as we're talking about testing, something that's always made me curious, can you walk us through what is it that you're looking at testing in when you're deploying a service in a service mesh against HCP? So you mentioned earlier that these Fargate tasks are kind of simulating a similar connection to the HCP control plane. If someone's going through and deploying a service mesh in their enterprise, what are the types of maybe functional tests or end-to-end tests that they may want to consider? And how do you look at that?
Yeah, so I would look at it based on what the application does with Consul, right? So I think we use a couple of particular pieces in our own control plane of Consul, like registering the service for dispatching traffic, for example. So like I might want to make sure I can register a service and then maybe route some traffic. And so really I would say it's about what you're doing with Consul because it can do so much. So that's how I really think about it. And I think about like, we have both internally and externally all the time. We find like ways we're using Consul that are surprising, or that maybe we're storing a value, a KV, or we're using Consul's KV. And so we're like storing a single value. And then we suddenly are storing maybe 10 values with a single key. And then we're like, oh, this actually needs to be separate keys. And so we shifted. And so like that might be something we catch with a test where we're like exceeding the value of maybe the HTTP put if we're talking to Consul over HTTP, or maybe you're just trying to figure out like how are you using it and then like test for that. And there may be whole parts of Consul, if you're deploying Consul for your own environment, that you might not test at all because you don't use it. And that's totally fine. Like, it's true. Maybe you upgrade past a bug and you never knew you had it. But if you're not using the functionality, like, it doesn't matter. So we talk a lot on the team amongst the engineers about like realistic tests. And like another thing that I think is really great that I would just put a plug in for, even though it's only tangential to your question, is like make sure they're tests you can run locally too. The engineering team of HCP is really proud of the fact that everything that we build and develop, including some of these tests, obviously Fargate isn't running locally, but you can do all of the bits of our control plane that we would use to run with a test locally. So you can test your complete local environment just as well as we're testing production, right? So that would be another like plug for making sure you can really test locally too.
Are they all in containers?
Yes, we're in a lot of containers on our workstations. Yeah, and funny enough, even things that like we don't run in containers in production and integration and other environments are in containers on our workstations for development.
Wow.
So
that's interesting.
A lot of containers
like,
on our workstations.
That's what I was gonna say. Like, how are your workstations still alive after?
Well, that's actually a good question. I think we've got some really smart folks on the team thinking about this and thinking about like, the whole Conway's Law thing about like, oh, your software models how your organization looks. And it's like, as we've grown more and more teams, we have like more and more containers. And so it's like, how do we maybe trim that down? Or how do I make sure that if I'm running a container for one service that like I don't have to run all of the other containers for a service I'm not working on. So like the dev environment, we have awesome release engineering folks, awesome SREs that are constantly like tuning that, solving problems, trying to like trim down so that you really can run the control plane whenever we can travel again, while you're on an airplane or something, right? Like get all of that to work locally without running out of memory.
Challenge accepted. Next time I'm on a plane, I expect to take that local testing suite and I will gladly test it for you.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, we really want to like, I think we find productivity is so like such a big deal. Something so simple can really slow everyone down if you don't think about it, design for it, plan for it, optimize it, all that stuff.
Okay, I have two questions then. One of them semi-rhetorical. Have you ever ran the control plane while being on Zoom at the same time? I think that's the real load test.
I have. I think that some folks, we all have different laptops too. That's an interesting point. Sometimes Apple's out of this many gigs of RAM, but has this one, and HashiCorp does a lot of hiring. So we're always, I think, getting a lot of laptops. So there's a real diversity of developer environments, but I do okay on Zoom with the control plane.
And the other question that we got was from online. How do you contain all your containers?
We use Nomad. So we're heavy Nomad users. In fact, like using Fargate is really about making something look like what a customer might do. But we definitely use Nomad for both on our workstations and in our like non-production and production control plane environments. Super excited to like have their 1.0 release and actually get to meet with that team pretty frequently and talk about things that we, problems we have and how we can help like give feedback to make that product better. So pretty heavy Nomad users.
So can you talk a little bit about why you wouldn't use Nomad as your I guess testing suite then? You mentioned that you're using the ECS and Fargate. Why not use Nomad to run those tests from it?
Yeah, I mean, we probably should also do that. I think one thing we wanted to do was really not test the same thing, like test with the same technology that we're also using. We're using Nomad every day, right? So like we are spinning up things in like containers in Nomad and talking to Consul. This is something we do all the time. And we have a lot of like internal customers using HCP as well. And I know a lot of them are using Nomad. So in some ways it's like already a better tested path probably than something like Fargate or even Amazon's Kubernetes service would be like another one, for example, where we would kind of want to test things that we don't already do every day. I think we find Nomad problems pretty quickly if we break something or break a Nomad definition for a job or something like that. That shows up very quick for us.
We have a second question,
Sure.
not necessarily related to containers or Nomad. But what is your favorite thing to work on at work and at home?
Gosh, I mean, in the time of a pandemic, everything is at home. So I don't. Yeah, I guess I like the problems that we have where where we do get to give feedback. So like we encounter problems. I know without like getting into details, there's been some container hosting services recently that have had some instability. And so it's like we talk to the Nomad team about like, hey, how can like we give feedback to this product or and this happens for lots of other things, whether it's using Vault to store certificates because HCP does a lot of certificates management. I like talking to the other teams and figuring out like kind of we see the rest of the way the world works, right? We've seen how AWS has solved a problem or how Microsoft has solved a problem, and I'm like I get really excited about the opportunities where it's like I can suggest and talk with for example, the Nomad team about how to solve the problem of pulling a container and the other side being unavailable. Like there's not a solution in some of the other container orchestration tools for that. So I get like really excited about talking about these things like problems that we all have that aren't solved by the existing tools, and then like maybe in the future the HashiCorp tools could solve them. And it's great because those teams aren't necessarily running the same kinds of workloads we are, so it's like feedback that they find really useful too, because we can say like we've been using Nomad for this and we pull these containers and there's been all these outages, and like what if it had a primary and a secondary, or what if it like just coming up with these like greenfield kind of how could we solve the problems that no one's solved yet. So I like that part of developing HCP. At home, I think I like I'm like a big remote work nerd. So before coming to HashiCorp, I was really into tools and things around their remote workspace and like integrations for Slack and all of that. And so those are the kinds of like toy projects I tend to mess with. But HashiCorp fully, totally remote. And so I think that here, like those projects have changed shape a little bit because I used to work with people in an office and remote people. But I love those projects, like, ones that help you figure out that your team is in a different time zone, or like who's awake, or like how to, I don't know, the ways in which we communicate with each other and the productivity tools for that across lots of time zones. That's kind of stuff I really like, just sort of stuff that where you can see your team on a map or like whatever it is. Those kinds of remote work things are always really interesting to me.
That's awesome. So I guess kind of now looking ahead, is there any new services coming out from Amazon, or any services that would be new to your testing suite or how you're running HCP that you can kind of give us a little teaser about that you might be excited to work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think I am interested in playing with that VPC connectivity tool just because it's like, it seems interesting to me. I'd love to figure out a way. I know that if you read their docs, it talks about using it sort of as a diagnostic tool, but I'd love to actually figure out a way to like operationalize it and have it be something where we're like always checking the reachability of certain things in our VPC. Maybe writing some policies like in Sentinel to check the reachability of our VPCs or something, and then like use that API to actually evaluate them. Also excited about, again, ECS has some other releases that are interesting. Having run larger services in ECS in the past, one problem you run into is that if your container isn't deploying, ECS will just like keep trying and trying and trying. And that, speaking of cost control, like just deploying constantly is expensive as well. And so they've got like a circuit breaker functionality now that they've put in so that you can actually truly fail a task definition that's being updated so that it like actually stops trying to deploy the new one. I would love to play with that. I feel like this is the year where reInvent has sort of gone back to feature announcements that were more basic, but like make the cloud better, right? Like better IOPS provisioning on their like new storage types, or like some of the new like robustness was that S3, or like new instance types where they've got AWS Nitro, where it's like much more reliable performance and things like that. So it's like all of these core primitives are getting updated, it seems like this time around, and I'm excited to see what that looks like. I don't want to keep adding storage to my instance to get better IOPS. Like we can really fine tune some things with some of these new options. So
I'm really excited, and I'm wondering, I was already excited for it before, but I'm wondering if it solves your Lambda problem, but the Lambda is now supporting container capabilities.
yeah,
So
there's a lot
I'm
of
excited.
interesting Lambda functionality for sure.
So we got a question coming in from online, which is, what was the most rewarding piece of testing that you've crafted regarding either Consul or using Fargate in your experience?
I mean, I think just seeing it work, because it feels like magic when you get it working the first time and you're like, oh my gosh, like I got the result, all of sort of the Rube Goldberg machine, but suddenly it's working and all of the, the ball rolls down here and it swings across to that thing. And like all of these pieces you've glued together, it's really rewarding to see them finally work. And then it gets really interesting after that too, because I think, it's both rewarding, it's a double-edged sword. It's rewarding to have the tests that give you all of this data you didn't have before. I'm like a big nerd when it comes to lots of interesting data, even if there's nothing I'm going to do with it. But like that data about how often it's passing and failing, and it really becomes like an important signal in how you monitor your service. But it's a double-edged sword too, because sometimes that stops you from writing more specific tests, right? Like you're like, oh, the main test is working or the main test is broken. Like that's my signal for I need to start an incident versus like everything is good. And like sometimes you want to write more specific tests than that, catch problems earlier. So that was very rewarding to get that like signal and start to see everybody rely on the test, but then think, wait, now we've got to write, what's the next step? What's the more specific test where we're not waiting to build a Consul cluster, connect it up, have the agent join, all of these steps that happen. Like, how do we write them even more tightly honed or sharply honed one of those?
Actually, it just occurred to me because I've been hearing the strugs on this one, which is certificates for Consul. So can you explain a little bit of how the certificates work in HCP? I know you briefly mentioned them as a point, but like what exactly, because it's the control plane offering that certificate, and there's a whole other set of certificates for Consul Service Mesh capability. But how does HCP handle the certs for control plane specifically?
Yeah, so there's like primarily two ways that we get certs. We do have our own internal CA for like our own control plane, but we don't typically issue certificates on customer Consul clusters with that, because we want them to be able to validate them and trust them. And that's why we actually use Let's Encrypt for certs for those data planes. It's tricky because Let's Encrypt requires, like, if you're going to use DNS validation, you actually have to, these sort of DNS names for Consul services where you're using Consul through its DNS interface. Like, it's going to be hard to validate those because they're often not real public DNS entries. But we use Let's Encrypt and we use our own internal CA, and we try to like choose the right thing depending on whether something is going to be, whether a customer is going to want to validate that or just as a public name versus something that is internal, that where they would just want to trust our CA. But we're constantly, I think we're probably one of a heavier user of Let's Encrypt for issuing certificates for Consul. We also, of course, like enable a lot of the security features underneath in HCP when you're deploying a Consul cluster. Like those all get certs. When they connect to each other and build quorum for the first time, we've issued them certs. Like we're doing all of the sort of security things there that you would want done to make sure that you can trust what we've deployed, and that it's like trusting even within itself, right? So, but yeah, Let's Encrypt when we do our own as well.
So when you're talking about security, and I think we can kind of step a little bit further back. So when you're talking about security for a managed service here, what are the steps that HCP kind of takes to address security? One of the things that comes to mind is like, how does HCP and the team approach rolling forward to new versions of features and exposing those security configurations to customers?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think some things we have to sort of do at the control inside HCP, because exposing them would be like exposing the config files for the Consul servers, for example. So like some of them we're sort of presetting for customers. Some of it, you know, even when we do that, we're sort of building on what the cloud providers offer for security. So, you know, one thing we try to really do there is everywhere we have the opportunity to separate the tenancy, right? That's like definitely an AWS best practice. It's like using the account boundary as a way to ensure isolation, separate tenancy, all of those things. And then I think, you know, we are constantly talking about with our product managers how to expose more security features. I think, like, just as an example, I know that as part of the design, as part of the HCP building work and designing work, getting a separate token we could use to bootstrap Consul that has because no one's offered really Consul as a SaaS like this. And so we had to invent like a totally new bootstrap token type where like, we don't want to have the token that a customer has. We want them to feel like, you know, to be sure they're secure in that being the only person or only entity holding that token. But then also we're running Consul as a service. So we have a token that's like an MSP type token. So that was like a design enhancement to Consul that came out of building HCP. And I think there are lots of other security concerns. We're just constantly trying to balance like exposing the features without also exposing too much of the underlying platform, because then we can't make security guarantees about that either, right? Like we want to make sure, for example, that your HCP Consul cluster has the latest patches on the operating system, that it's not exposed to the network if you don't like to the public internet if you don't want it to. There's like a lot of dimensions of security, but we actually have an awesome security team, and we have product security folks that actually sit and work with the development teams. So we have like lots of consultations with those folks, and they give us really good advice there too. And then we, like everything else, I know we've mentioned this a million times, but we test it. So we're constantly validating that, like, you know, this is not open to this call, right? Like the EC2 instance metadata service is a popular one these days for security exposures, right? Where if services can look at the metadata service, it can leak resources, it can leak info. You might be able to get an IAM role out of it. Like that's an example of one where it's like, we're constantly making sure that that's not open, for example, so that if maybe you're letting someone in your organization use an HCP Consul cluster you created, like you want to have your own security guarantees there. So we're constantly testing all of those things, even just RBAC models, security, like permissions, call at the API level. All of that stuff needs testing.
Well, we've got a lot of people who are interested in testing. So we've got one more question about testing, which is, what is the coolest or most surprising piece of data you've gotten back from testing?
Let's see. Specifically with the ECS and Fargate tests. I don't know about you all, but every time I read a blog post where somebody like allocated 1,000 instances on AWS and like what they found, right? Like how many of them took how much time to spin up and like all of that kind of stuff. I think for us, likewise, we can really see how the cloud providers orchestrate and perform when we're just constantly testing stuff on their platforms, right? So even simple things like where they reach out to us and say, hey, we noticed every time you deploy this, you do A, B, and C, and like it's creating noise. So it's like those kinds of things where if you only ever spin up an EC2 instance or two here or there, you might not notice that a particular availability zone behaves differently or is slower or runs out of instances. That happens in some of the cloud providers without naming names, but some of them are like, oh, we actually don't have any more of this instance type right now. So there's all kinds of interesting, like you sort of get to see a little bit under the covers of what they're building and what their operational requirements are. Even simple things like rate limiting, where if you read AWS's documentation, they reserve the right to rate limit API calls, and they don't publish in some cases what the rate limits are. So it's like, oh, okay, there's an incident over here and this rate limit's been pulled way down, or those kinds of things are always super interesting too.
So one of the last questions that I have with a couple more minutes here, and I encourage everyone who's watching online, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat. But one of the last questions that I have is for folks who are working with ECS or maybe trying to understand AWS's resources a little bit better. Do you have any recommendations for resources that people can use either for Amazon resources or for those who are interested in getting started in HCP?
Yeah, so I know there's a lot of content like on our own Learn site for getting started with HCP. I know that like folks like Rosemary have tested some of that content to make sure that people have run through it to make sure that it's good. But I would say also, there's an AWS containers blog that is pretty useful. And I think one other thing I would recommend that I don't know that a lot of people do is AWS announces like community heroes every so often. And whenever I see one of those, if they're writing about like areas that I find interesting, like if I see somebody who's like, it says, works on Fargate and does a lot of presentations on Fargate, like I might go follow them on Twitter or like go look up on YouTube what they've, recent talks they've given, things like that. And then like definitely folks at HashiCorp there are definitely folks at HashiCorp writing about containers in AWS as well. I think we've got some like on the HashiCorp YouTube channel as well that are probably worth watching around running Fargate and Consul agents, and even folks that I think like us tried to do it in Lambda. So if you Google that stuff, you'll find like Twitter threads about it, but eventually you'll also find some YouTube videos about it that I would recommend. I could put some of those, I can get some of those over to you guys and you can post them with this.
Sounds awesome. So we're going to keep the deep dives going here. Tomorrow we have Vault, where we're going to go over a little bit more information around Vault and how we're working with Amazon. Thursday, we also have deep dives on the AWS provider for Terraform, as well as some information around ECS, Waypoint, and Terraform. For all of the office hours we're offering through this year, as well as leading into next year, check us out at hashicorp.com/community/office hours. If you want to keep the conversation going on anything AWS and HashiCorp related, please take a look at discuss.hashicorp.com, where our community and members from our engineering team all come together and talk about new releases, features, answer questions, and even help build solutions. Check us out on Twitter at HashiCorp, as well as at HashiCorp users. We'd love to hear more about how you're using our services, how you're liking re:Event, and all the new announcements as well too. And with that, any final words, Rosemary or Martin?
It's been great hanging out with you all.
Yeah. We have one question, but it's a joke question just because it was posed to me as a joke question and I couldn't remember it. But what is the quadratic formula?
I generally would say I do use math I learned every day, but that is not one of them.
It's okay. I couldn't remember it either. So, but Martin, I appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge about testing, AWS. You don't have to, I don't remember the quadratic formula. You don't have to remember the quadratic formula, but I did extract some valuable information about testing. So I hope others as well have found some interest, at least in how HashiCorp dog food's its own products. I know we got a little Nomad shout out in there, and hopefully we get a little bit more content on it next year.
Looking forward to it. And for everyone who's joined us online, thank you very much for your time. We hope to see you again in the next live event.